when it comes to narrative traditions, it's come up so many times during this entire conversation that things get changed up all the time,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's on like a person to person level or whether it's like region by region. And I think it's Chelsea, you alluded to it earlier. You're clicked in here. I think that is an inherent part of the power of storytelling, and that it can be personalized into your own individual tradition and the way that you carry that on to the next generation. But, Chelsea, I'll get your take on this. How do you approach, your respective mythologies and folklore and that kind of thing from a place of A, respect, but also B, from the standpoint of a writer who's, elaborating on their craft and their narrative abilities?
Yeah. So I think for me, it all comes down to just, I guess, honesty. Like, when I tell people, these are the versions of the Thousand and One Nights that I grew up with. It's, very possible that you grew up with different versions, that you are familiar with these stories in a different way. So usually when I talk about my writing this story, it came from a very personal place for me. And I'm very cognizant of, the way these stories have evolved even within, that region. And the way how, like, they change across the countries. What I hear in Kuwait might be very different than a story that you would hear in, Saudi Arabia. But so I always my sort of framework, and this was my framework for going into the story, is that this was a very personal story for me. So I'm just very honest about the fact that this is limited to my perspective, and the way I experienced these stories growing up, I think.
Yeah, I like that. And why do you feel that mythology and these stories still resonate with people so strongly today, especially from our perspective as people who love fantasy and things like that?
I think, I mean, we've kind of, we've touched at this on multiple times, I think, but stories are human, and we tell stories in order to make sense of the way the world is, and the way it can potentially be. I think about sci-fi a lot, and I'm not a sci-fi writer, but what people can do with sci-fi is incredible. Balancing this sort of, here's this knowledge of what we have of human nature today, and here is the way it could potentially be in the future. So I think storytelling in that way is a way for us to process human nature, and also just to explore it as well. And one of the things that I love about fantasy, I think fantasy often gets a bad rep from people who don't read it, who say like, oh, what am I going to get from fantasy? This is a fantastical story. I don't, what is it about this that's, it's not literary. It's not going to educate me. But the thing about fantasy is that it allows you to view things about human nature from a distance, I think. All stories are inherently human in some way. So if you have something in fantasy, it doesn't matter that it's in a different world. You're still writing characters who are human. You're still writing characters who are reacting to things and to stories and their culture and their environment in human ways. So every time I talk about fantasy, I always say, it's escapism. Sometimes it can be escapism, but if you
Definitely.
look deeper, you see a lot of these echoes of human nature and cultures and all of these things that we have in our own reality. The incredible thing about fantasy is that it's just been refashioned and
Yes.
reshaped, into a different world, into different cultures, which, is one of my favorite things about it.
Yeah, me too, 100%. It's like this mirror that is held up to humanity to reflect what is there, but also give it, it's like the mirror in Snow White, where it's like showing your deepest desires, but it's like this is escapism on one hand, but at the same time you're
Yeah.
learning about human nature, you're learning about empathy and emotions and characters and relationships and all these different things, just through the lens of something that some people would chide for being, childish or fantastical in a negative connotation. I think some people just
Mm-hmm.
don't really click in their head that it's like there's so much nuance and depth to the layers that you can present to readers in fantasy stories, but also absorb as a reader. And Gabriela, what about you? Like, what's your take on sort of this power that narrative and storytelling has? But at the same time, you know, for someone who's giving Slavic folklore and mythology a more of like a modern, how would I put this? Like a modern reintroduction in a sort of way to a lot of people who may not be completely aware of it. What kind of emotional resonance does that give you as a writer?
Well, first of all, like several questions now. So I'm just gonna back to it. So just sort of tying in with what Chelsea was saying, it made me. It reminded me of a panel I did a few months back with Empathy Lab. It's Empathy Lab is a UK charity, but it's doing some fascinating work. So they're working with neurologists and basically brain scientists of all descriptions, psychologists, who show that there's a direct and measurable impact that reading fiction has on our ability to empathize. And that you can actually, we all are born with a certain level of empathy, that is the ability to, you know, sort of imagine other people's feelings. Like that's how it's. So it's not about like being sympathizing, but the ability to put yourself in the mental state of someone else. And you know, they do interesting things like they scan the brain of a person. So if you have two people and one of the people is given a sort of electroshock, the other person who's witnessing it, the same areas in their brain light up as in sort of like pain response, as the person
empathetic
who
pain
is,
response.
who is getting the electroshock. So that's a kind of how we measure empathy. And apparently in the same way, reading fiction and other people's lives through fiction, you do experience those same things that the character is going through on a different level, naturally. But you do sort of experience that, and that fiction has the ability to train empathy in people. So that is something that I find quite interesting.
So fascinating.
And so again, and with what Zamina was saying about, you know, basically othering whole ethnic groups or having sort of, you know, I mean, dehumanizing, I mean, in certain cases, that's, you know, obviously that's certainly the case, but it's not just dehumanizing. I think it's like, even when it's like kind of one step back, when it's like, this group of people, this nation is just not like me. And then like, I kind of, and in some ways, yes, obviously culturally we differ. Our, you know, values in different societies are completely different, which people tend to underappreciate, I think, in certain places. Like I find, especially when people are of a certain descent, like, so I've seen it a lot of from quite a few people who are like, you know, based in the States, but are not of a certain culture, but their like grandparents are from, you know, Poland, from Japan, from Kenya, whatever, and they would put their sensibilities onto that other culture that they don't inhabit, and, you know, for that get things wrong. So I think while it's very important to sort of acknowledge that there are differences, but it doesn't mean that as humans we're different, if it makes sense. So I think it's, so those, I think I wouldn't want people to erase that, and I wouldn't, you know, while I want people to be inspired and, you know, write stuff about Slavic folklore, I'm very happy, always very happy when people are inspired by it. I want there to be an acknowledgement that this is like, there's certain cultural elements here that we have to respect, but also that it's not that they're completely different people. They're, you know, we have like really nice Polish people, we have really shit Polish people, we have, you know,
just like anywhere else in the world.
Just like everywhere.
Exactly. So, you know, I think when you other people, there's always, or you put like a certain group as a sort of completely separate. You either fetishize them, as in like, you know, you mustn't criticize this group of people, you mustn't say anything about this group of people, or you go the opposite direction and dehumanize them, as, you know, kind of post 9/11 we've seen. And I think fiction has this power to sort of bring it back, like what Chelsea was saying as well,
a good middle
like
ground.
just making people human. And, you know, but their reactions are not always nice or what we'd like, how we'd like people to behave, but they're human. So as long as they're believable, as those, like, your characters you create are really believable and like kind of realistic in the way they behave, that brings those cultures sort of closer together, and it allows people to access those different aspects of the cultures. And that's something that's very important to me.